Signore e signori, buonasera, welcome, benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò della New York University. We are delighted to have you here for the third evening of our marathon into the origins of Italian European cinema and the dive. Tonight we are again up for a great treat with this film that we're seeing, and for the debate and the Q&A that is going to follow the film, and for the presentation before it. We have the fortune of having with us Jane Gaines, who is the founder of Women Film Pioneers Project, and she's a professor of cinema at Columbia University. And she's going to be in conversation with Eugenio Refini, the chair of our Department of Italian Studies here, at the end of the film. But before we start with that, I'm going to ask Mila and Eugenio to come to the podium. And in the meantime, talking about women pioneers in the early phase of cinema, we talk about the diva, and we normally associate the diva to an idea of glamour, of beauty, of fashion. And I was just thinking these days to the sentence that we heard from Francesca Bertini in the documentary that we saw on Friday. When she talks about Assunta Spina, she says very nonchalantly, "Il neorealismo me lo sono inventato io." I invented neorealism in 1913 with Assunta Spina. And at first you think, okay, she's the mad diva that is aged badly. And then she explains it. And you find that she has a point, that there are major elements of neorealism in Assunta Spina. And Francesca Bertini, as it very often happened with these divae, was not only there to act whatever the director told her, but had actually the ability and the authority to impose certain choices also in the production of the film. So talking about protagonists and how a diva can be a diva in many different ways, not only proposing herself as a model of beauty, of elegance, but also in bending the history of cinema in a certain direction rather than another. So Francesca Bertini, from now on, to me, is the inventor of neorealism. So if this is a small accomplishment of this series, I think it's not. And also because I teach cinema, so this assumption that I had this illumination is going to be transmitted to my students. Without further ado, I would like to ask the curator of this retrospective, Mila Tenaglia, and the chair of our Department of Italian Studies, Eugenio Refini, to come to the podium. Please.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here tonight. So we are going to see a beautiful movie by Mario Caserini called L'amor mio non muore, and this is the third night of Drama Queens. Actually was a class that Eugenio Refini taught a few months ago, so if you want to say something. And also it's a special night because we are going to have live piano music by Levi Pugh, so later you are going to hear a wonderful performance. And enjoy the movie, please. And then we're gonna welcome Jane Gaines, and as you said, Stefano, she's the founder of the Women Film Pioneer Project, and you founded in 1993, so it's been a while. You're gonna have the chance to say more about this and about the project. Thank you.
Very briefly, just to say that I'm very happy to be doing these in the company of Mila Tenaglia, who's been sort of the mastermind behind this project. And really the idea sort of stemmed out of a conversation we had a few months ago. I was teaching a class which I've been teaching for a few years now at NYU, entitled Drama Queens. It's a class on opera. It's not about cinema, but of course what happens in the early 20th century is that there's an interesting connection. These divas sort of move around, and of course there's a connection between what happens with divas on the operatic stage, divas on the stage of spoken drama, and then divas on the stage of film. And so we thought about bridging across the experience of the diva tradition in opera and the diva tradition in silent film. And of course the film which you are gonna see tonight is really about that, because we have this idea of performance getting into the story, into the plot of the film. And so just to say once again thank you to Mila for coming up with this idea, and thank you all for being with us. It's the third installment, and we have another night, Friday night, to sort of finish our series. So enjoy the film, and we will have several things coming up later.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Welcome,
you.
Jane.
So, okay, couple of terms for you, Italian native speakers. The concept of cinema muto, which is the title of the Giornata del Cinema Muto, the silent festival in Cile and Pordenone, Italy, that many of us have been going to for years as the way to learn Italian from native speakers, but also to see the great restorations in 35 millimeter screen. For many years, these were mostly prints in 35 millimeter, and the Federation of International Archives would always premiere some wonderful restoration. So because you have Lyda Borelli, a high-res copy today, it's because the Bologna Festival and the Italian government supporting that festival went to the trouble in 2013 of doing a complete restoration. And before that, we might have seen it on the screen in Pordenone or Sicile, but we learned that silent cinema had a better name. Cinema muto is better. It's about basically the divas as divine, but also as melos as in music, and the concept of cinemelografia, which I learned from my colleague Giorgio Bertinelli, who is an Italian historian of cinema. And I love this because it's a way of combining visual language and musical language. And there is, in English, no such term. So it's the muto, that voicelessness or speechlessness that's important, because silent cinema was never silent. There was always music. And if we take the Italian term on its face, then we really see that there is such a thing as visual music. And that's how I want you to be thinking about this film that we translate often as My Love Will Never Die in English, because we're just learning Italian. And if we think about the silent art as arte muta, then muto and muta help us think about the way that it doesn't speak in language as in word language, because it's using this other register and it's conveying what can't be spoken. And so I'm suggesting that this idea of speechlessness is useful for thinking and experiencing the things that can't be put into words. And so that could be the tradition of opera, but certainly the film you're about to see. Now, I need to tell you that, of course, we like to believe that Lyda Borelli would be the beginning, but the beginning of the diva tradition is Asta Nielsen, who is Danish, and her company with her partner Urban Glad actually becomes a German company. But in 1911, in 1910 and 1911, the film that we understand as The Abyss in English had wide circulation in Europe. Took a little time to get to the US because it was censored. This scene that everyone recalls is what we would today just say is a sadomasochistic scene staged, and the brutality of this scene was difficult for audiences to take. But I jumped from that 1910, 1911 example to the Black Dream, and I note that the Black Dream, this is the beginning of the diva tradition, Asta Nielsen, corresponds with Lyda Borelli's great moment. And what I want you to do, this is the last scene in the film, is to pay attention to how amazing it is. This is the same year as Asta Nielsen, and she's out-diva the original diva. I think I want you to imagine there is no other diva film that has her die upside down in close-up on a chaise lounge, en français, chaise lounge. They always die on a chaise lounge. Asta Nielsen is being shot and dying in her lover's arms on a chaise lounge. And I believe that this film, which we in English call Everlasting Love, was actually written in order to give her this death scene. So I also want to mention Mexico. This is especially important for those of us who try to reach in the US across the borders. And the fact that Asta Nielsen was screened in Latin America, but more importantly, Lyda Borelli took a trip to Latin America. Mimi Durba, who in 1917 started a company in Mexico City right after the revolution, and that Azteca Film Company had a short life. None of her films survived, but pieces are in archives. And Lyda Borelli toured in 1914, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, and Mexico. And what do we have? The film you're going to see tonight, 1913, did its screen in the other parts of Latin America, where the diva tradition definitely descends from the Italians. Now, I also wanted to be sure that you took a close look at the Salome costume, and note that Mimi Durba's costume is almost identical to Lyda Borelli's. What does that tell us about the connection between the Mexican divas and Italy? It was not Asta Nielsen, it was Lyda Borelli. So, it should be an echo. I love to think about echoing, not imitating. It should be an echo throughout all of those countries that were visited. And then I want you to think about her costumes as coming off her body. A Salome costume, clearly, which she kept from the stage, clearly is tight and keeps alive this tension between the sensuousness of that seductress, the Salome character, and the innocence of the woman who's married in this film that you're about to see, and is not able to have the marriage that she wants because of a deceptive and deceitful spy. So the bodily poses that she takes are so carefully costumed. I want you to think about this. Why are they both seductive and innocent at the same time? Can she move between the two within the same film? The high-necked costume in white that she begins with as the unmarried daughter, and then having to take these stage roles. Then I want you to think carefully about landscape in Lyda Borelli. So why is it that they put her so often in water? And I'm going to show you a clip from her against the ocean. And I'm thinking that the connotations of the natural landscape just sort of overflow into the expressivity, the wonderfully opulent expressivity of her body and the emotional vibrations that she gives off. So this is just one shot, and it's borrowing the waves as the lovers are just, I suppose they're sailing on the Mediterranean. Then Art Nouveau. If I think about Art Nouveau is that it was associated with the natural, with twigs and trees and the gardens, but it's so artificial. And look at the promotion for Lyda Borelli's film. And then closely note, this is one of my favorite setups, the Art Nouveau mirror. The triptych mirror in her dressing room. There is no other scene in cinema like these dressing room scenes in which you're actually seeing more than one scene at once, because you're seeing the scene reflected in distance, giving depth to the drama. And then Lyda in the foreground, wearing the Salome costume, which is falling off her shoulder. Then please also to understand that there is a fascination that some of us have with these Italian divas who were not always divas. They were, I like to think about the conference that we had in Bologna one year on women in the silent screen, and the title was Non Solo Dive, to argue that there were, as in Elvira Notari, directors and producers, and the Women Pioneers Project that's at Columbia. The Columbia Library actually has supported this database for over 10 years. And it keeps growing because we began with the premise that women were not just actresses in the silent era, which takes us from 1896 all the way up to, in the US, 1927, but in parts of the world up to 1937. When we think about China, we think about the Indian cinema. But what I want to propose here is that Lyda Borelli, because she began in 1909 with a company, and I put this at the top, that was a theatrical company, and with her co-producer, Roggio Ruggieri, they actually were theatrical producers. And so what role does she step into, like or not like these other pioneers who put their names on these companies? And I love it that Elvira Notari gives names her company after a woman, and Daisy filmed Daisy Sylvan after herself, and a very important Elvira Gianella Liana film after a woman. We don't even know who it was, but they grab the reins of these companies and they make choices. And this is why I'm thinking that we can nominate Lyda Borelli, who in a way is like the fantastic Francesca Bertini, who we celebrate tonight as having invented neorealism, because later we've gone back and discovered that, for instance, her collaborator, Gustavo Sorina, said that actually she had directed Assunta Spina. Not credited, but what contribution does Lyda Borelli make significantly to the film you're going to see tonight? And here's the whole point. I am an anti-auteurist and dedicated to spreading that gospel, because there's so much collaboration in motion pictures. I suppose it's like the theater when you have so many jobs. But the director does not embody as the actors and the complex contributions that Lyda Borelli is making at the level of pose, interpretation, physical embodiment, and grasp of the narrative and where she belongs in it. There is no director who can put, usually himself, in her place. So we have to rethink, especially with these divas, what contributions are they making? Now, last, I'm going to make one, how should we say, intervention into encouraging you to see in a new way Love Everlasting as Lyda Borelli's film. Because there's a way in which I'm describing, this is a scene I'm going to show you from a collage, a montage. There's a way in which she's drawing from the architecture, position within the architecture, drawing from the sculptural space, steps, at the bottom or the top of steps. She's so consistently filmed relative to architectural columns, in and out of windows and doors, and the landscape, which she, in this case, I'm going to show you one small clip. She's pulling from the wind, interpreting this beach scene, which is very sad, relative to isolation. Then she's joined with someone. But how is it that she seems almost inextricable from that windy beach? So this is the fragment, you could say, the remnant of films found in the Dutch archive. Lyrical Nitrate in 1991 put these pieces together, and these three shots, I'm only going to show you from the first, the beach scene. These are three Lyda Borelli moments that exist where there is no other film, no complete film. And for many years, this is 1991, this is all we had of Lyda Borelli in this Peter Delput compilation from the Now I Institute. So what I want you to see here is, music's going to come up very slowly after the silence. How is it that she's able to realize this character and use the waves, the sand, and they'll be very, very, very silent coming up, and always interpreting with posture, with physicality. And then what happens when we finally move from silence to the violin strains? Do they speak because she doesn't? There are very few intertitles in her films. So is this so sad that one can't put her feeling into words? So, okay, that's it to prepare you. I know you want more, so let's see the feature.
Thank you.
Hey, wow, this
Wow, yeah.
great. So I think, well, you know, this is just a treat. I mean, this is a fantastic movie, and there's so many things to say. You know, to say that to have the live music accompaniment was just yet another treat. I mean, it was really kind of heartbreaking. And I think really, since we have the piano man with us, and you know, live music, which is such an important part of the story in a way, we should probably begin maybe brainstorming about the place of music in this.
Absolutely.
Right, Jane?
No, absolutely. And I just want to say, I've heard so much silent accompanying in Italy and in New York and in Los Angeles, and this was really incredibly magnificent. And I was wondering if we could talk about 4 particular sequences, because they stood out to me as unusual. And this comes from a place where Eugenia and I have both been talking about our literary backgrounds and how we've had to abandon them to some degree to teach opera, and I now teach a Hollywood score. And so I think a lot about this, what is the relation, it's sound and image problem between the musicality, but also the effects, and the narrative that's the structure of the 90 to 120-minute film. And I wanted to quote, before we begin, Gillian Anderson, who is the Library of Congress's and Museum of Modern Art's go-to strategic orchestra conductor, but also researcher of the early cinema scores. She says the music is 50% of the silent film experience. 50%. So I wanted to say there were some surprises for me, and 4 sequences stand out. That the difficulty of the admiral's suicide. Right. There were so many resonances in that suicide. It's really kind of 2-part when he opens up the empty attaché case, we call it that. Yeah. And the way in which it gets at the mixed feelings. So here's what's interesting is that you say, okay, the dialogue has to be translated in such a way that it's expressively complex, but mixed emotions is very difficult. But if you have a piano and the range of things that Levi did with this piano that I had not heard a piano made to do, and the complexity of that, he takes his time. You don't know if it's going to be a gun, if it's going to be to his head. And so we're anxious, and the definition of suspense, as we know in narrative theory, is the delay and withholding of the action that we most want to happen. So that sequence stuck out. And then when he had to replicate the playing of the organ when she goes into the cathedral, how do you make a piano sound like an organ? But it's got to do double duty because it's also got to have a tonality that reaches him on the outside, so it's got to be very silent, but then in an odd way resonant in the tonalities of the piano that must be organ-like, and it reaches him. So that's quite astonishing. And then I also note just 2 other moments. That what she finds out by picking up the piece of paper, that in fact her lover is this very son, that's not as big as the magnificent, effectively, drum roll when he finds out. It's like a rumbling when he finds out that in fact this tragedy, it's the double whammy for him. It's bigger than her recognition scene. And then finally, the difficulty, it seemed to me, of that end tragedy, that you played the low, the bass, and the treble at the same time. When we see her take the poison, and because she's committed suicide or killed herself 8 times in 14 films. So this is the beginning. She's an expert at it. She's really, really, really terrifically excellent at figuring out how to die and how to make love backwards. The backwards embrace. And then how to elongate the agony of dying from poison. How do you replicate dying from poison if you've never died from poison? But I wonder if you could comment a little about your interpretation and how the difficulty of these particular scenes you had to translate into one keyboard.
Yeah. Would you like me to come up and speak?
Yes, please.
Sure. So this isn't my first. This is my first rodeo doing this. This is my fifth film accompanying for an audience with an improvised score, and the biggest difficulty is always handling the extremely clever misdirection and elongation of moments that happens in silent film. I mean, there is so much that they just keep you hanging on and hanging on and hanging on. That I have to be prepared to pivot. I tend usually to view the film in full for the first time while I'm performing it, and that's the case tonight. And the reason that I do that is because I want the, I don't know, like the fear of not knowing, but I also want the ability to be swept up for the first time. So I mean, could you what's your question specifically exactly? I feel like I could say a lot about this.
Well, the question, the difficulty of the suicide scene, we just take that because it's fresh in everyone's memory, is that it struck me that you have the low, basically the bass, the rumble in the bass, which is the terror and the horror of what she's doing. But then you have this some kind of ethereal in the treble at the same time. And the distance between the two, it seemed to me, was almost getting us closer to the incongruity of she's doing this, she's killing herself for love. Is there anything more incongruous than that?
Yeah, I mean, I you know, to be honest, a lot of the things that I do are not necessarily conscious choices that I can put into words. I mean, that's the beauty of this mode of interpretation, this style of performance, is that I couldn't necessarily explain to you what my choice was there. If I were to become a theorist right now and do some music theory investigation, I mean, I wanted to capture an immense amount of dark space in between the two ideas, sort of like a ringing in the ears of something beautiful and something decaying. And then, yeah, I mean, the groundedness of that low D-flat octave. I mean, I played in D-flat for most of the film because I think it's my favorite key on the piano. I think there's something incredibly dark and cavernous about even D-flat major. And I chose a specific chord. I remember the chord that I played, and I can try and play it just real quick. I believe if this was the sound you were referring to, that kind of sound, I've left this note in there. Traditionally, if you were to resolve a D-flat chord, you would have this. But I left in this tense note. I mean, to indicate that there is a lack of resolution there. I mean, it is a suicide. I mean, I'll leave it up to the theorists to comment on what I did in this. Yeah, I wanted there to be a lack of resolution. I mean, a suicide is not a resolution. Death can sometimes be seen as a resolution, I feel like, in narrative storytelling. But this felt just completely open. And I didn't want it to be too showy either. I wanted it to be these ringing, almost like a gong or bells in the distance. But yeah, that's all I can really say about that scene. The suicide of the general, I mean, that was one scene that was difficult for me to interpret just because there was so much back and forth where he was uncertain
You didn't get to
in
it.
himself. Yeah, and it felt like a different sort of thing. I mean, it was for the loss of his dignity and his honor and that sort of thing, and not necessarily out of love. So it was a very different attitude, and there was a lot more, I felt like, confusion leading up to it rather than agony or misery necessarily. It was a lot of like frantic. It almost felt like he had a duty to do this to himself. At least that's how I felt as I was watching it for the first time. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on those scenes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. In fact, what is also fascinating, and I think this is something which really the live music was making so powerful, is that we do have sort of diegetic music in the story, in the sense that we have instruments, as Jane was remembering. We have the organ, we also have the piano coming up, and of course, what was beautifully done was the sort of switching from your music, Levi, as the kind of broader commentary of what was happening on screen, to the actual sound of those instruments in a way. And that's also kind of a transition which, of course, in terms of we, the audience, receiving what we are seeing is crucial, right? Because it's kind of a change of gear almost. And that was beautifully done, seamlessly, and yet so meaningfully. And I think this sort of speaks a lot to these various layers kind of working together in these not so silent films, right? I would like to maybe bring up one other element for discussion, which has to do with the finale, because really the suicide is a masterful scene, and it's probably one of the points in the film where this film gets closer to opera. Of course, we have several scenes in the movie where she is performing on stage, with this beautiful situation where we see her from behind. That's a kind of another element of genius, and those are clear sort of staging of a performance situation. But then I was thinking that the finale with the protagonist taking the poison, made me think of this opera in particular, Fedora by Giordano, which is kind of in many ways very similar to what's happening here. The plot is different, but there are some elements which come back, and it's always been described as a very cinematic opera because it's very sort of quick in the dramatic pace, and so it's interesting to see how, looking at 20, 30 years in the history of both silent film and opera happening more or less at the same time, the very end of the 19th century up to the 1920s, and sort of thinking about these two sister arts looking at one another is extremely fascinating. And so, Jane, if you have thoughts about this particular quality of this interaction of these two art forms here, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, this is so interesting because you're telling me that Fedora was an opera. Well, there is a piece of Francesco Bertini's one piece left in the George Eastman House in Rochester, and I saw it there, and I had it played in Los Angeles, and I kept a copy, which I'll share with you. Right. The film version. The only part left is the death scene.
Right.
And what's so interesting, thinking about it relative to opera, and this scene that you just saw, is that in Fedora, she poisons herself because she's the villainess in the middle of the sequence. And her lover doesn't know that she's ruined his life and the life of everyone else he loves.
Right.
So it's actually more complicated, but my question to you is the question of song, because I'm thinking of Vera Notari. She would use the Napoleon singers to perform in her films in Naples as groups, but the version that the Bologna archive restored in the DVD has some singing on some song, operatic song, performed on this version, and I'm thinking, okay, there are no English titles in the one I saw, and the Internet Archive has one version of it. So just to sing is different from the speechlessness with orchestral or music by piano accompaniment. And so the question I have to you is, what does being able to sing musically change? Because that would be, I'm guessing, the key element. To open your mouth and actually have music come out of your mouth, not dialogue.
Yeah.
not spoken dialogue. So that's, to me, the hard problem. What dimension does it add? Is it subtracted in the silent film, where we have so much extra that we have to contribute? And I wanted to make one comment here about your question of not thinking that suicide was a resolution. And Mila asked me to talk a little bit about melodrama, and there are ways in which I call these the 5 R's of melodrama, one of which is, well, reconciliation, which we had in a way. Another is recognition, and we had misrecognition and recognition. But resolution, melodrama often is thought to resolve because either the ending is happy and perhaps tacked on, or suicide solves the problem. But then, this is very interesting that you say this about it couldn't be solved. I love this quote from Alfred Hitchcock and Bernard Herrmann worked together. Bernard Herrmann did the scores for many years, and Bernard Herrmann always said the job fell to him to resolve the murderous family melodramas that Hitchcock had produced, but that it was impossible. I mean, I added that, but I think that that's right. The music would attempt to resolve in a major key, but you end with D flat.
Sure. It was a strange chord. Yeah.
No, but that's incredible insight into this problem. Again and again, American melodrama was criticized worldwide for too much happy ending. But then the tradition of opera is what?
Yeah, it's really about mostly tragic ending, right?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, I think that you're sort of bringing up here a very important point, which has to do with the way in which these various forms of performing arts were indexed and also received and perceived. I think, of course, we have to imagine a situation where the audience attending these kind of films would be extremely conversant with what was happening, both in terms of spoken drama and in terms of opera. And what is interesting is the entanglement of the three, because actually, you know, Tosca, Fedora, all these kind of stories were existing at the very same time as plays for spoken drama, as operas, and eventually as films. And what happens, of course, with the transition to film is that both the spoken dimension and the sung dimension get to be sort of, I mean, not totally deleted, because we sort of see them doing those kind of things, but of course what we hear is something else, right? And so there's a repositioning of these various sensorial stimuli in the experience of going to the movies. What I'm really fascinated by is the idea that the audience, beyond being, of course, enjoying the live performance of the music in the film, they would also have in their memory, in their ears, the experience of going both to the plays and to opera. And so I'm always sort of wondering how all that also factors in the reception of this particular kind of silent film. Because of course, it's not that they were totally naive in approaching these kind of products. They were kind of using possibly other sort of experiences they had already.
So they wouldn't think they were missing something. Because no one was singing on the screen.
But something would be then
something
made up. Exactly,
yeah.
Right? And I think it's both the visual. Of course, we shouldn't underestimate how powerful the visual is here. Of course, the experience of the film is that we can see their faces, their movements, their gestures much better and much closer than whatever happens on a real stage, right? So I think there's an element of compensation which has to do both with the actual sound of what's happening with the live accompaniment, but also with the visual, which is really introducing an element which is slightly foreign to the experience of attending a show at the theater. Even when you are sitting in the first row at the opera, you don't really get to see the faces of the performers that well. And I think that's another element of difference which might play a role.
Well, here's where we know that maybe we know the history of the theater, but the crucial thing about the history of motion pictures is in the early close-ups, the thought was that there were two schools, and I'm pulling from Marion Doan's new book, Bigger Than Life, and she argues that the close-up was terrifying to some audience members, and critics were very critical. And then we always had these stories about people thought that heads had been cut off and hands and feet had been cut off. So that was circulating, but the critical discourse around it, the aberration and the monstrosity, that was the word that was used, of the close-up, as theater goers would never have imagined or envisioned. So that the reception history of cinema, we have to remember that it's so significantly different from the theater.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, and this maybe could be our last point, is that all these threads are actually these days coming back when we sort of think about the ways in which live performances in HD are received. These days we have all these operas streamed, even live, and the close-up available at that point, of course, is totally foreign to what the normal experience of opera would be. So some of these questions, keep changing in terms of the medium involved, but they keep coming up. So maybe, we could see whether we have questions from the audience.
I have a question.
We have a microphone, coming down.
I have a question and a bit of an observation. My question is, although we were given one title to this film, all the intertitles had the title loading up at the bottom. Was that the original title of the film? Do we know? And then my observation is the fact that the title of the film that we are given, muore, that is the last line of Puccini's Ma non l'esco. That's her dying exhalation. And I just found that to be an interesting operatic connection with this that audiences at the time probably would have recognized. Yeah.
What's for you?
I think this last point, yes, totally. And that's really something which certainly they would catch. For the Gloria thing, I'm not sure because as it is the company, right? Because I think they would. This is something which I noticed even in the other films shown in the festival. There's always the name of the production.
Oh, that's the name of the production.
Yeah.
Yes. Did they have film reviewers at the time these films were made? Did they actually have people reviewing the films?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. That's interesting.
Any other questions?
One last question there.
How many days or
If you could-
months or some, I'm just wondering about the, how long it takes to film back then, and, because it looked like it was all done on location. How did they do that?
I'm so glad you asked that, because did anyone notice how the silk billowed? Is it outside? Because it suspiciously looked to me like they were using exterior light during the day with no top on. That's how they shot in New York. Anyone who here lives in New York, this is the top of the buildings outside, because they didn't have lights that were as, how should I say, powerful as they needed, arc lights that they later developed. So I think that is possible. And also I noticed to save money, what I love about this is it's so abbreviated, there are no really transitions between a lot of these scenes. It's just, let's set this up because we had these key moments that we want for her. And that cut costs. So my guessing is that the production cost went into her costumes, B, all those velvet curtains, and a lot of extras in the audience, which takes time. And then the exterior scenes, all of these marble stair steps and palaces, they just moved into it. And then they used the mountains and the roads.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is the 79 minutes. They could do this. They had, the flowers, bring up those huge flowers.
Yes.
Bring in the flowers. They had all of the theatrical experience that it seems to me that clearly they're drawing from that tradition.
Yeah.
But I love it that they place the camera behind him and then behind her looking out at the audience.
Yeah.
Maybe it's an existing audience for an opera that they just borrowed.
That's a very interesting question. How would they sort of manage that particular? If you have the orchestra, we see the orchestra, we see the audience. I agree that the idea of sort of mixing the layers with, especially at the end when he's looking at her and we sort of we see him from behind,
and then suddenly we're
she's
on the
looking
stage.
at us. I mean,
It's like it's a room.
Exactly, but that creates such a hook for us as well, and that's exactly the same thing which had happened sort of before the other way around. So okay, yes.
I didn't understand what you're saying about something billowing.
Oh, it's her skirts billowing because it's the air. It's moving. Her clothes are moving.
I mean, what in the outdoor shots?
Yeah, it's like air, you know.
Or indoors, so
moving.
they would have a fan?
Or fans, sure,
Yeah.
possibly.
Okay, thank you.
Most unusual and wonderful.
Yeah. I want to see it again now, again.
Yeah, so I'm mostly familiar with the really early films that were shot in like Northern California, and a lot of those, because they're utilizing the sun, a lot of those interior sets are basically stage walls with no roof.
No roof.
Right.
So the whole problem of getting wind coming through was a thing, and they're just, a lot of them were just set up so there's like 4 rooms, and they're doing 4 different shots at one time because there's not recording sound. It doesn't matter how loud it is. And they're just, they're doing almost as a factory sort of thing. But yeah, they're just stage walls with no roof.
Right.
Sunlight.
Yeah, because that's how you get that depth of field going on with that incredible like depth, like deep focus shots in there. Because you need that
And
much
the
light.
mirror gives so much depth. I hope everybody noticed how wonderful that mirror shot.
Yeah.
Sets of mirror shots.
Yeah, the mirror shots are great. We were talking about mirrors even yesterday. Well, okay.
This is a brilliant audience.
Everything.
Oh, is that the last?
Yes, well, the very last one, yes.
Okay, I have a quick question. So, when we were first walking in, you were discussing kind of how these divas have a more directorial role in these films. And so I had that going through my head as I was watching the different sequences. And I wonder if you could comment on maybe the feminine perspective throughout this film.
Well, that is so tough because we don't believe in an essential feminism or whatever, that women do things essentially differently. They have different sociological experiences, right? So, but there, I mean, you could do a comparison here because his way of, you think you could describe him as sour when he's alone. I mean, he really is deeply depressed and ill. And okay, do men experience depression differently? Okay, well, we have sociological and physiological evidence to that. And she has a more range, bodily possibilities for expressing this melancholy, it seems to me, than he does. Now, that's just an observation, and you could maybe clock that. You could count. But she's thought that through. How many different poses and variations on the poses? How many pretzels can she really agonize her body into? And then he has this one sulk.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
She does much more in a way, right? Because of course she's using all sorts of instruments, bodily.
And perhaps experience as a woman.
Yeah.
And agony. But his experience of agony might be different as an actor, and then what is it? Actors are supposed to draw on the experience that they have. So that's how we could deal with that sociological experience, gender difference.
They both have the ornament.
Oh yes, there's this. Yes, but that's the Del Sarte. Am I right? That's the Del Sarte gesture compendium, the encyclopedia of French
exactly.
gestures. Yes, they all. It's like a dictionary.
Yeah.
That
It's with a code.
Del Sarte. Francois Del Sarte. Francois Del Sarte. And yeah, it's encyclopedia, and it's sketched out so that they could look at what it looks like to make a face and a hand gesture to convey frustration. These are Victorian emotions that we don't have anymore. It's like agony, I guess. We still have that. We can understand that.
Yeah, but the idea of sort of capturing these gestures and making them almost
Like
a lexicon which can be shared.
Yeah, like
and
a
repeated.
hieroglyphic of
Yeah.
what does it look like?
Yeah. Right. I'm afraid we have to wrap things up because I would like to sort of thank Jane again, and of course Levi Pugh for the music, and Mila again for organizing this. And thank you all for being with us tonight. We have the last installment Friday night, 6:30.